lightsabers. How are you guys tonight? I was upstairs praying for us and I sat on the tack. It was quite painful, and I didn't know if that had anything to say about what was going to happen tonight, but I kind of hope not. Have you guys ever had a moment as followers of Jesus where you have just like totally blown it? Can you relate to me in this? I mean, here we are at the end of the week, right? Just to recap where we've come from. We started this week talking about temptation and how Jesus is unflinching in the face of temptation and unveils reality for us so that we can be unflinching too. And then the next night we get to encounter the Jesus who heals us, who sets us free. I love it. And then the next night we talk about just surrender and giving all of who we are to Him. And then last night, the cross. We come to that place of Jesus dealing with sin for all time, right? The curtain tearing and offering us access and freedom to Him. And so we've already come past that place now of like salvation and sin being taken care of, right? He finished it. He did it. And tonight, we're going to come to our last narrative encounter with Jesus in John 21. And in John 21, we still have failure in our midst. You guys can open to it. I'm not going to read it for time's sake, but you can begin to skim it. We're gonna journey through this passage together. But here we are, a post-salvation moment with Peter. And have you ever had a moment like this? A post-cross moment, a post-salvation encounter with Jesus moment when you just totally bombed, just blew it. You know what I mean? Are you there with me yet emotionally? I was a sophomore in college, and I had just been asked to lead my first Bible study with Intervarsity, and I was really excited about it. I was scared. I'd never been scared of a leadership position before Intervarsity because I thought spiritual leadership is a different thing, and I could really like screw people's lives up if I... You don't know what I'm talking about, do you? Just like, what am I going to do with this? So I start leading this Bible study, and I'm in Intervarsity, but, I was a school music student, and so I was... You guys will cheer for anything, I swear. But, here I am. Okay. We're on a time limit here. So here I am. I'm in Intervarsity. I'm in this Christian community. I'm trying to lead a Bible study. I'm kind of scared of it, but I'm kind of excited about it. And I'm in the school of music, and really these non-Christian school of music kind of became my primary community over my Christian friends because it's like you're just with them all the time. I don't know if you know what it's like to be in arts in college, but it's like, day and night, you know what I mean? You're just together. Those are your people. So I'm leading Bible study, but these guys kind of became my primary community. And I come to this place coming into college where, I was kind of good at stuff I did growing up, and I'm kind of an achiever, so if I don't know how to do something, I just kind of figure it out, and I do pretty well for myself. But I got to college, and I don't know if you know, but college will humble a person real quick. There's like all these people that were better than me and more talented than me, and it was like my identity was like crumbling a little bit, and was just wrestling with some really like deep melancholy and loneliness and just like who am I kind of flow. And because my Christian community wasn't my primary community, I was hanging out with these non-Christians all the time, I started drinking. And it was like just really embarrassing, guys, even now to talk about it with you because I was, out of one side of my mouth talking about the hope that Jesus offers your life, and out of the other side, I was turning to these non-believers to try and deal with these struggles I had in life. And I wasn't just like drinking a little, I was overdoing it, and I was stealing. I worked at a hotel, and we would steal liquor that people had bought for their big 200 people banquets, and we would drink while we were working, and it was really embarrassing. And when I would hang out with my non-Christian friends, they would be drinking and I would drink. And just the longer the year went on, I just, something in my soul, there just became like a rift there. It was like I was these two people. I was with my Intervarsity people, and I was leading Bible study, and I was talking about Jesus and how you should live your life for Jesus. And yet I was dealing with my problems the same way the world dealt with their problems. And I remember, guys, the amount of shame and guilt that began to take root in my life in that season. Just how embarrassed I felt. Here I had this group of friends that we were working for something on campus, and not only was I betraying my relationship with Jesus, but I was betraying this community and what we were trying to accomplish, And I remember telling my staff workers and eventually telling my leadership team and having this thing come out in the open. And even though it was kind of out there, I just still felt distant from God, and I felt distant from them. I just felt the weight of my shame, the embarrassment of the dualism that had taken root in my life, And that feeling, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, I'm sure I'm the only one, but that feeling of just deep shame, that is the sense that we have to come to this passage with tonight in John 21, where we see Jesus encountering Peter back on the lake fishing. That's the kind of emotion that we have to carry with us as we look at this narrative. Just to give you a little bit of context, I don't know how much you know about Peter, but he's kind of one of the characters I relate most to in the New Testament. And Peter's kind of, I don't know why I just envision Peter like this big kind of like burly, roughneck, bearded, like, do you ever watch The Deadliest Catch? Like one of those guys, you know what I'm saying? Just like scruffy and gnarly and like, would get knocked off the boat by a big crab wrap or something and pass out and still live to see the next day. I just imagine Peter that way. And Peter's always like just shooting off at the mouth. He's kind of like impulsive, just does something before thinking about it. And earlier in this gospel, Jesus is predicting his death, and Peter's there. And Jesus is kind of saying, this is what's going to go down. I'm going to die. You're all going to turn your back on me. And you remember Peter, right? He's the big mouth that jumps up and is like beating his chest. He's like, not me, Jesus. I'm not going anywhere. I am with you till the end. Me and you, Jesus. We're going there. You remember that? And you remember Jesus' response? It's so embarrassing because he doesn't even call him Peter. He's like, Simon, Simon. Remember that? Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Before this is over with, you will deny me not once, but 3 times. And not long after that night when Jesus said that to him, Peter found himself standing next to a charcoal fire, and a young girl came up and began to ask him about his relationship to Jesus. And before maybe he even realized what was happening, 3 times he totally denied his friendship with Jesus. And then, we saw the story last night where Jesus is taken to the cross and he dies, and it's that dark night in the soul of humanity when the hope of these disciples, they must have wondered, what have we invested these past 3 years in? This Messiah that we hoped in, he's gone now, And then that beautiful dawn 3 days later when he comes back and he rises from the dead, and Jesus actually appears to the disciples twice before the passage that we're going to be in tonight in John 21. 2 times. He goes and hangs out with them. And when he spends time with them the second time, he says, now, this is great, we're here together, I got some stuff I gotta go do, but wait here in Jerusalem, and I'm gonna send the Holy Spirit, right? But if you take a glimpse at your passage in John 21, where we find Peter and some of these disciples tonight is in Galilee. And I never thought about this before. Because I always just thought when Jesus rose from the dead, right, and he showed up and showed them the wounds, and he's like, guys, I'm back. I just thought it was like dogpile. Jesus is here. We are so happy. Life is good, And it was just like, they were all together and they were like, yeah, man, Jesus. All that stuff that just happened a few days ago, we're Jesus, you're back. We're here, But then I realized he told them to stay in Jerusalem, but they're in Galilee. And that's a long way away. And what are they doing in Galilee? And who led them there, And I suspect Peter probably led them there. He's a leader, and in this passage, when he decides to go fishing, he's the one that makes that decision, and the people follow him. And I began to think, what must that last encounter have actually been like? Because I think they were glad to see Jesus during that last encounter, but I think that lingering air of shame and distance between them and Jesus must have been there. And guys, it must have been the worst for Peter, right? Because they all denied him, but Peter's the only one that has the big mouth that promised he would never do it, And Peter was not just in the 12, he was in the 3, right? He was there for everything they were there for, the healings and the feeding of the 5,000, and right, Jesus doing all the miracles and doing all the preaching and teaching, but he was there at the transfiguration too, he got to see that happen. And then he shoots off at the mouth, and then he fails Jesus, and I just think the amount of shame he feels has to be deep, 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 deep. Deeper than some of the other disciples, maybe. And Peter, he was impulsive and capricious, but he always had known Jesus had loved him, and he always felt close to Jesus until now. And maybe now it was different because of what had transpired. They were different. Peter was different, and the thickness of shame and embarrassment, it hung in the air between them. in the midst of this glad reunion. Because see, Peter cannot bear what's happened. Jesus has resurrected from the dead, but Peter has not resurrected from his failure yet. He cannot deal with what he has done. Maybe he thinks to himself, that was a good run with Jesus while it lasted, you know. After all, I can't really be a leader. He probably doesn't want me anymore. I'm probably just going to screw this thing up anyways, whatever it is he's trying to do in the world. And, you know, it's probably too much to believe that whole, like, kingdom to come and transformation and you can fish for people thing. And maybe it was just too much to hope in that. And that thing he said about me being a rock, that was a beautiful dream, but, you know, that's not me. I'm not that guy. I'm too wishy-washy. I'm too impulsive, and I'd probably just let him down again anyways, you know? And so he probably just thought, let me go home, back to Galilee. Let me go back to fishing. I know how to do that. That's safe, right? That's comfortable. I can do it. And so we find him with these 6 disciples now in Galilee, back in their boats fishing. You know, a number of years ago, back in like the 1950s, this guy, you might have heard of, Walt Disney. He had, maybe you've heard of him. I don't know. He had built Disneyland out in California already, but he'd begun to dream about another place that he wanted to build, and it was called the Florida Project. And people, what? You haven't even heard what it is yet. They just are happy about Florida, just whatever. He began to dream about this thing called the Florida Project, and it was going to be like this awesome futuristic city, like a city like no one had seen before. So he bought up 47 square miles of land in the middle of Florida. And he began to dream about this place that was going to be called the Experiment Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Apparently you're catching on. So he began to dream about Epcot, and in his mind, this place was already real. And this is what he said it would be. Epcot will take its cue from new ideas and new technologies that are emerging from the forefront of American industry. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never be completed because it will always be showcasing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems. So he bought up this huge lot of land, and he was going to build a city that would be the home to 20,000 residents. And he had already built all these diagrams. You can actually see the video online of all the models he built. And in the center of this city was going to be like all the commerce, all these beautiful tall skyscrapers where all the business would happen. And then in the circle outside of that would be like community buildings and like schools and places of education and recreation and parks and stuff like that. And then on the outer perimeter of the city would be where the residents lived. But there would be no traffic in the city, so the monorail, you've probably ridden that if you've been to Disney World. That was going to be his system of transportation above ground. But then he built a transportation system below ground. One level would have cars driving on it, and then the level below that would have like large vehicles driving on it. And he had designed it in these big circular patterns around the city so there would never be a traffic light that would like interrupt the flow of traffic. Wouldn't that be awesome? And he had even dreamed up how like garbage would be collected in the city in a way that would be like totally awesome and no one would ever know what was happening, you know, because it was Walt Disney and he thought about details like that. But he had dreamed of this really imaginative city that would be forever in the States, a showcase of something of the future, something to hope for, something to dream for. His colleagues and people that worked for him, they thought he was a little bit crazy. They thought, I think this idea is a little bit too fantastic. I'm not sure that he can really do this. Behind his back, they would call it Waltopia, from the Greek word utopia, meaning no place. You know, they just thought, whatever, Waltopia, you know, it's never going to happen. He died unexpectedly in the 1960s, and these colleagues of his that were left behind, they didn't really have the ability to see beyond their proven formulas. Once he was gone, and the dream that he had with his death, they didn't really have the ability to see his vision for the future. And so they began to re-examine this project and look at it from a more practical standpoint, from an economical operations technology standpoint. And in I think it was 82, Epcot opened, and instead of like a stream of residents going to their first day of work, what you had was an ocean of tourists that came to hang out at the bottom side of that big golf ball shaped spaceship. And they were there to like buy souvenirs and consume prefabricated experiences, you know. That's what they were there for. And the grand city of tomorrow that Walt Disney had dreamed of, it died along with him. There's a study that's been done, I don't want to hurt your feelings, it says Epcot is the least favorite part of all the parks in Walt Disney. I don't know if you've been, but I would tend to agree. I'm sorry. It has become the subject of ridicule and mockery of many, many people, including me tonight. And This comedian actually said this about Epcot. Listen to this. He said, with Epcot Center, the Disney Corporation has accomplished something I did not think was possible in today's world. They have created a land of make-believe that is worse than regular life. I didn't say it. That guy did. And so this gleaming golf ball looking pearl above the horizon of Florida has become a landmark to a fantastic, beautiful dream of the future that never got realized. There is a way, you guys, in which failure and loss of relationship with Jesus, the great visionary of our lives, causes us to settle and disqualify ourselves from his mission. We may keep the name Christian and we may call ourselves Jesus followers, but when we fail in some big way, a chasm grows between us and him, and we go back to living some emasculated version of the life that Jesus has dreamed up for us. And it doesn't even come close anymore to the incredible, beautiful life that Jesus has imagined for you, the one where he gives you a new name and a purpose and a place in his mission to seek and save the lost. And maybe for some of you, this week you have begun to dream, or this year you have begun to dream for the first time, and believe that maybe you have a role in God's redemptive work on campus. Maybe you've begun to believe a little bit that possibly you could lead a small group or reach out to some specific group of people on campus or take more risks in inviting people to places where Jesus is going to be talked about, or maybe you've begun to believe that you maybe could care for younger leaders in your chapter or reach out to people from different cultural backgrounds than your own. Maybe for the first time you've begun to believe that Jesus has a destiny for you in his kingdom work that you can walk towards. And as a warning of love from me to you, I just have to tell you guys, failure will come. You must know. I'm sorry to have to say it to you, but it will happen. Maybe next week, maybe this summer. I had a friend in college. Summers were always the worst when you're kind of away from your new community. You go back and you have this weird relationship with your parents where you're kind of an adult, but kind of not. They're still telling you when to go to bed. And you're just like, it's confusing. And you get back with your old friends. And he called it the summer of suck. That's what he called it. It's just like a deep pit of despair that he fell into, And I don't know. Maybe that's going to happen for you this summer or maybe next year. I don't know. But failure will come in this place of post-cross encounter with Jesus where you're trying to follow him. Failure will happen. And you will be tempted to settle for Epcot and lose sight of the dreams that God has for your participation in his mission for salvation and restoration of the campus. But guys, the good news for us tonight in this passage in John 21 is that Jesus is not okay with us settling for some lesser version of the life that he has called us to. He was not okay with Peter going back to fishing. He had invested too much in him. And even now, in this passage, when we see Peter and the disciples disobeying him, because that's what this is, disobedience. He told them to stay and wait, right? And they went back to Galilee. Even then, Jesus is the one coming to Peter. You've got to see the beauty of this. Jesus is the one standing on the shore, calling out to them, hey guys, how's your fishing been going tonight? Did you catch anything? Jesus is the one calling out to him. Jesus is the one giving them a catch for the night. Jesus is the one on the shore preparing a meal for them. Jesus is the one initiating conversation and asking Peter questions in the midst of his running. You have to get the beauty of this scene, you guys. This scene is like a theater of restoration being staged just for Peter. It's beautiful. You have to understand. When Jesus is standing on the shore, they're out there fishing all night long. All these like roughneck, experienced fishermen, they haven't caught anything. And Jesus is on the shore shouting out, hey guys, did you get anything? How's it going? Maybe you should try the other side. I mean, imagine being an experienced fisherman, right? It was probably felt rude the first time he asked them back when. And here he is doing it again. And it's a call back to that first time that he called Peter to follow him, right? When he said, why don't you try the other side? And the nets fill up and they begin to burst in that first story. And then John leans over and he's like, Peter, it's the Lord. That's what he says. After they put their nets in and it fills up again, John leans over and he's like, Peter, it's the Lord. And Peter's like, I don't know why he's naked out there in the boat. I'm not a fisherman, but I have fished. And I don't know why he's naked, but he has to actually put on clothes so he can jump in the water. But when he hears it's the Lord, he jumps in the water and he begins to swim to him to the shore, And Jesus is there with a fire that he has built so he can make food for them. And John the writer is really specific about the details. It's not just any fire, it's a charcoal fire. And probably the last charcoal fire that Peter had stood next to was that night when that little girl began to ask him if he knew Jesus. And it's like, if we were watching a movie, it would be like flashbacks, right? And here Jesus is with this charcoal fire, and he's got some bread and a little bit of fish that he's made for them. And we flash back to that night of the Last Supper when Jesus was the one there, unrobing himself and beginning to wash the disciples' feet and breaking bread and serving them. The Master, the Messiah, the crucified, resurrected Messiah of the universe is serving bread and fish again. And Peter probably remembers that moment in the upper room, the last moment when he really felt close to Jesus. And here Jesus is serving him again. And then there's those 3 painful questions asked in the community of friends. 3 times denied, 3 times asked. And it's this moment of tough love for Peter, you know, but it's this beautiful, beautiful theater of restoration set up just for Peter. We're like Peter, aren't we? When we fail, we think, I've screwed up, Jesus is alive, but I'm an idiot, and I'm weak, and I cannot be useful to him. He probably does not want me anymore anyways. But what we learn from Jesus in this passage is that failure does not necessarily negate Peter's calling. In a way, it defines it. Do you hear me? That failure does not negate calling, but in a way, it defines it. I don't know if you guys know much about Beethoven. He was a great German composer that lived a very, very, very long time ago. He was a prodigy. By the time he was 13, he wrote his first 3 sonatas. This guy, was brilliant at playing the piano because before he was a composer, he was a pianist. And still to this day, there's probably not been a piano player that has lived that could play the piano the way that Beethoven played it. And so he composed his first 3 sonatas by the time he was 13. He played for the royal court. And people were just in awe of his playing. He would compose music that would showcase his ability to play the piano. And he kind of came up under the shadow of these other 2 guys you might know, Haydn and Mozart. And he kind of just lived in their shadow for a long time. And Mozart was a brilliant, brilliant composer. But he was kind of like a partier. He lived the party life. He was young. And he did a lot of partying, so he died really young. And Beethoven never really got to learn from him or be an apprentice to him. He just kind of lived in his shadow. But once Mozart had passed away, Beethoven moved to Vienna, and he became the premier pianist there in Vienna. And he continued to compose, and he began to write symphonies, groundbreaking symphonies, the first one ever to use voice in them. And he wrote his first opera, and this is just in his 20s, It's like, overachieving, come on. And when he was about 27 or 28, Beethoven began to lose his hearing. And by the time he was 30, he was completely deaf. Couldn't hear a note, completely deaf, The shame of Beethoven as a composer losing his hearing was so deep and so great for him that he just began to isolate himself from people. And he just kind of became like a misanthrope. And he was so embarrassed, you guys. He didn't want people to know that this great pianist and composer couldn't hear anymore. So he just kind of tucked away in his house, and he continued to compose or whatever. But he was like your real typical tortured artist, just really was always in love, but no one ever loved him back. And he would write music like the Moonlight Sonata. A lot of his pieces were written for women that he loved, that never returned his affection. He was just really lonely, really kind of tragic guy once he lost his hearing. And his final symphony that he wrote was Symphony No. 9. I don't know if you've ever heard this piece of music before. It is a brilliant, beautiful, just really extraordinary, massive piece of music. It was the first symphony to include voices, and it began to turn the tide of music from the classical era to the romantic era. And after that, everyone wanted to try to put voices, in their symphonies. And the 4th movement alone of the 9th Symphony is like a symphony in itself. It's just beautiful. If you haven't heard it, you should listen to it. His writing was very outside of the box and very groundbreaking. And the critics that wrote about him at that time, they said it sounded like the music of a madman when they heard this Symphony No. 9 for the first time. All the music he wrote at the end of his life, including that symphony, he wrote completely deaf, never hearing a note of it except what he heard in his head. The first time Symphony No. 9 was played in public, it received 5 standing ovations, and he didn't have a clue because he was there listening to the music, and they're standing up. He hadn't heard a note of the piece of music. They had to turn him around. This guy who was a total misanthrope, isolated himself from society because of the shame of his deafness. They turned him around, and he began to weep. when he saw how his music had impacted the people. And I wonder, how did this guy, deaf, not hearing any music, how did he write a piece of music like this? If you read a little bit about Beethoven, you'll find that he was a religious man, and some of the last things that he wrote, he said that God, the Creator, had put something inside of him and that he could not die until he found a way to get it out. And I don't know if it was something about his deafness and being closed into his mind and that feeling of weakness and shame that brought him into this deep conversation with God, where maybe he could hear him because of that place of desperation in a way that he had not heard him before, and that maybe no one had heard him before. And this music just began to churn in him, and it was like God was whispering into his ear. And in that secret place, this thing that he felt like the Creator had deposited in him began to come out. And his deafness became the source of his greatest gift to the world. And for you tonight, students, you need to know that your calling, it could be tied up with some of your greatest failures. And guys, it is appropriate that Jesus asked me to talk to you about failure, because there has been no more profound a place in my life that I have encountered Jesus than in the midst of failure. But sometimes our calling is tied up with our greatest failures. I mean, take Peter, for instance. That night when Jesus asked him that question 3 times, he said, well, he called him Simon again. It's embarrassing, but Simon, do you love me? And he said, feed my sheep. And I heard someone say once that Peter was probably the worst candidate of all the 12 to be a pastor. You know what I'm saying? Like, to shepherd people. Think about Peter. He's always shooting off the mouth, over-promising and under-delivering. And when things get like a little bit conflicty, he just whips out a sword and chops a guy's ear off. And it's like, what? There's conflict. What did you want me to do? So we've got Peter here with all the worst qualities of a pastor ever, pretty much, And he's the guy that Jesus is calling to be a nurturer of people. How is that? Guys, our mission on campus is real. And I believe with everything in me that what the campus staff and what you as students do on campus is the most important thing happening in the university world today. And you may feel too weak sometimes to get involved. And for those of you who are involved in ministry on your campus, maybe you struggle a little bit. Maybe you struggle a little bit to see the worth and the value of what you do. And maybe when it comes time to do gigs and proxy stations and evangelism, maybe what you see or what you're tempted to see is a scary situation where you're just like trying to work up the nerve and the courage, to talk about Jesus and kind of hope you don't lose face or friends in the process, But what I see is a situation ripe with potential and opportunity for the voice of God to break through space and time and call people back to Him who are so distant and so far away. And maybe for you, when you go to your large groups, or for some of us, your like medium-sized large groups, maybe you can get that. But some of us have large groups, and some of us have like medium-sized. Anyways, it's not important. But maybe you go there, and maybe what you see is like a little awkward group of people, Do you ever feel that way when you're at your large group? Do you ever just look around and all of a sudden you kind of notice, like, we're awkward. Like, we play weird games, and we're kind of strange. I don't know why people come hang out with us. Our worship is good sometimes, and our teaching's good sometimes, our program, it's okay, but you ever feel that way? Like, we're just kind of awkward. But the truth is, I don't know who's representing, but I try to do who's representing. You're losing me here. But I think sometimes you feel weak. You struggle to see the value in what you're doing in those moments in small groups and large groups. But guys, what I see is the potential for communities of healing and hope, where you as a campus fellowship get to be the kiss of God to a wounded campus. Maybe it's in the place of our greatest deafness that we find our greatest desperation for God. And can we let Him come to us in our weakness, you guys, and speak words of life that will transform us? And can we take risks to get into His mission on campus? I'm going to ask the worship team to make their way down and begin to kind of wrap up. There's something else I see in this passage as Jesus begins to ask him those 3 painful questions. And you got to know, this is an awkward moment for the disciples. I mean, they're all sitting around watching this happen. We'd all like to think it was just Jesus and Peter off to the side, like, Peter, do you love me? But it wasn't like that. They're all there watching it happen. And he's asking this question, do you love me? And his response is, feed my sheep. And there's a sense in this passage that Jesus doesn't really allow for the idea of discipleship first and then mission. He doesn't really call Peter to go into some kind of 4-step discipleship process so he can get his life all together before he gets back into his mission, right? He says, do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. And it's a side note, I'm not going to talk about it, but there is something important for us as communities to learn from this passage about what it means to reconcile, particularly leaders who have failed. And the disciples are all sitting there watching this happen, because it wasn't just Jesus that he betrayed. He had failed them too. He had overpromised to them too and underdelivered to them too. And you got to imagine, it feels so awkward because Jesus has built the whole charcoal fire. And he's been like all Captain Obvious about the situation, and he's like asking Peter, do you love me? And the disciples have just got to be like shuffling their feet and just feeling, Jesus, this is so awkward. Why are you doing this in front of us, And we're like that sometimes when people fail in our communities. We want to avoid it. We're not sure how to handle it. But there is something beautiful in this passage that we need to learn about being communities of reconciliation, where we can put our stuff out there with each other in a loving way, be honest and confront each other and bring people back into the community and back into mission. But the thing I really want to get at in this passage, you guys, is that some of what I think the point is for Jesus in this passage is that for our discipleship and our maturation in him as followers, our worship and our devotion and our restoration has to happen in the context of community and mission. They're not separate. I mean, if we were all trying to get our lives together before we got involved in God's mission, none of us would ever get involved, would we? I don't know about you, but I haven't. The more I know Jesus, the more I know how jacked up I am. So it's like, you think you're going to go, in a good direction, and you really you get to see all your dirt, But I think he's calling us to be devoted to him in the context of community and mission. And this image of feeding sheep is a really profound image that you have to understand. If you don't grasp anything tonight, you have to grasp the importance of Jesus calling Peter, this failure, to feed sheep. This image of feeding sheep is so important to Jesus. It recollects for me the scene of the feeding of the 5,000. You remember when the crowd is there and they're listening to Jesus and he looks out and he sees them and he says they look helpless and harassed like sheep without a shepherd. And he said his heart was moved with compassion for them. And then there's that passage later where Jesus begins to talk about being a good shepherd, and he talks about the difference between being a good shepherd and being a hired hand, And last night, remember Taylor was talking to us about how when you see Jesus, when you see the heart of Jesus and the character of Jesus, you see the heart of God. And you see the character of God. And the idea of feeding sheep has always been important to him. I remember Ezekiel 34, where the leaders of Israel, they started exploiting the people that God had set them over to lead. And they had left them helpless and harassed and exploited and isolated and without direction. And they had taken advantage of them. And God was so furious with it because his task of spiritual leaders taking care of sheep was so close to his heart that he kind of said, you know what? You're not really getting this right. And if you can't be just and fair and loving and compassionate and take care of the people I've given you to take care of, I'm going to do it myself. That's what he said. And guys, hear these words of Jesus, of God in Ezekiel and what he said that day. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on the day of clouds and of darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel and in the ravines and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend to them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend to my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. You see, this task of feeding sheep is so close to the heart of God, you guys, and it was the very thing that he was calling this frail, broken failure of a disciple to do, to feed sheep. He invited him into that precious work, you guys. And I wonder for you tonight, students, can you hear the voice of Jesus coming to you saying, do you love me? salvation, you guys. It's a question of restoration, of calling, and of mission. Do you hear him asking you, do you love me? Feed my sheep. He's not asking you for offerings or for penance or for elaborate religious rituals tonight, but to love, to serve, to create opportunities on campus for others to encounter Jesus and make up their mind about him. Do you hear him asking you tonight, do you love me? Feed my sheep. In all of your fear, in all of your timidity and your fragility and your brokenness, you guys, that call that Jesus gave Peter that day is the same call he's giving you tonight. I've heard from your own mouths these past 2 weeks, last week and this week, stories about death threats that people have received on campus, about rape and sexual abuse, about depression and suicidal tendencies among your peers. I've heard about classrooms that shake you to the core with skepticism and outright rejection of even the possibility that Jesus could be who he said he was. I've heard stories of real demonic spiritual oppression. I've seen it in the schools in my own area. I've even seen a student in the past 2 years sell her best friend to a guy in her dorm for sex so that she could get a plane ticket so her and her friend could hang out. I've seen students come close to mental illness, functioning as alcoholics on campus. We've watched students on some of our campuses be interviewed about that Saturday morning shameful walk that has become the norm for young women who are giving themselves away to men they barely know every weekend. Don't you know that when Jesus looks at your campus and your university, that he sees a people who are helpless and harassed, like sheep without a shepherd? And don't you know that he melts with compassion when he sees them and burns with urgency to bring hope and restoration to them? And his question tonight is, do you love me? Do what I have always done and feed my sheep. As we begin to close tonight, I just have 2 ways that I want to ask you to respond to Jesus. You know, some of you this week, you've been looking at leadership and small group leaders and in the leadership track, and you've been in the call trying to discover who Jesus is and what he's about in the world and in kingdom life and in the Old Testament, what is the character of God and how should I be as a believer? And I just want to ask you tonight, if you're ready to offer yourself in weakness to the mission of God on your campus, even if you don't know what that looks like totally yet, practically speaking, if you feel that urgency in your own heart, Jesus speaking to you tonight, and you want to say yes in your weakness to serve his mission on campus, I want you to take a risk tonight. I'm going to ask the staff to begin to stand up on the edges of the room. Maybe a couple of you can come down here to this open space and in the back. And if you want to say yes to that tonight, I just want to ask you to go over to one of the staff and let them pray for you. Staff, it can just be a brief prayer of blessing and setting them apart for the work of God on their campus. And I know you don't know what that means, and it's okay, and it can feel a little bit scary, but you can trust that if Jesus is asking you to do that and you say yes to him tonight, he's going to help you with those next steps. So that's the first thing. If you want to offer yourself in weakness to God's work on campus, take a risk to go and let a staff pray for you during this time. The second thing, maybe some of you feel like you need God to give you a deeper burden for the brokenness of your campus. Maybe you just feel like, I'm not sure I see the campus the way Jesus sees it, and I want to tonight. I just want to ask you to turn to a friend next to you and just begin to pray and ask Jesus for his heart and for his eyes for the people on your campus. So I'm just going to open us in prayer, and they're just going to continue to play in the background. And I'm just going to ask you to respond in one of those 2 ways, or both if you want. Go at it. But go let someone pray for you if you're ready to get involved in God's mission on campus. Or maybe begin to pray with someone next to you for a burden for the brokenness of your campus. Jesus, we invite you into this moment. God, it's been a long week, and we just admit, Lord, that maybe some of us are a little tired and we feel full from what you've already done. But Jesus, would you come once again tonight? Bring your presence into this moment, Lord. I don't want to miss your heart